I'm Stephen Miller. I'm a professor emeritus of information systems. I've been living in Singapore over 21 years. Those first few years I was working with industry, and then for about 18 years working with one of our local universities. I founded one of the schools of what is now called Computing and Information Systems. And through my many years here, I've been involved in a number of smart city, smart nation projects. I do a lot of work with how organizations, public and private sector, use advanced computing, analytics, artificial intelligence. As a result of doing those projects, I've come to know our people in GovTech over the years and have had the opportunity to work with them and observe how they function. I will be your interviewer today, interviewing Cheow Hoe.
Hi, my name is Cheow Hoe, and I'm currently the Government Chief Digital Technology Officer of Singapore. I concurrently hold the appointment of Deputy Chief Executive of GovTech. I joined the government in 2014, which is about 8 years ago, from the private sector, of which I spent about 20 years in financial services. I joined the government because during that time, there was a compelling need for Singapore to transform itself into a smart nation. As announced by our Prime Minister in 2014, digital technology is a very important component of moving the government into the future. So during that period in time, when I came in, my job was really to help facilitate the digital transformation of Singapore. And we had many ups and downs over the last 8 years. And the good news is that I think there were a tremendous amount of lessons we have learned over this very interesting journey. You'll see in these recordings some of the more details that we'll go through in terms of some of the big things we've done, as well as some of the key lessons that we have learned so that other countries do not probably have to make the same mistakes as us again. So thank you very much for watching us, and we will proceed on to the main segment of this discussion.
Cheow Hoe, could you summarize your thoughts on why you feel there is a compelling need for digitization in government?
Yeah, thanks, Steve. I think that's a very important question. If you look at how the entire industry has moved over the last 15 years, the advent of people like Google, Facebook, Amazon, all of a sudden you'll find that government is not spared from this transformation. Citizens expect the government to function as effectively and as efficiently as these FANG companies. And for the government to be able to become effective going forward, digitalization is the only way forward. So why does all government all of a sudden want to run on this journey? Because they realize that there's a better way of doing things. And digitalization isn't just about computerization. It's about a better way of doing things with the help of technology. And the FANG companies have shown us very early on that technology can make a very big difference, whether it's from a customer service point of view, whether it's from optimization of cost point of view, whether it's ability to outreach to literally millions of people. Digital technology becomes really the core and center of these things. And so government has to follow suit, and if not, keep in track with the so-called the rest of the industry to survive.
Almost the last 30 years, you have been involved as a professional with applying information technology in both private sector and public sector settings. And we've been doing computerization for a long time. The Singapore government started on computerization in the mid or late 70s, major programs beginning in the 80s. Why do people use the term now digitization and digital government versus making more use of computers and computerization? Is it just terminology, or is there something more to this difference?
Steve, I think there's really a lot more. When the journey first started, probably in the 80s, it was about deploying computers on the desk of every civil servant to make people become more efficient. And that's the key word, right? Instead of using a typewriter, you use a computer. Have you changed anything? Not really. You have made things more efficient. You are probably able to transmit data in a better way. The real change actually came probably in the late 90s or 2000, where the concept of e-services came into play, whereby all of a sudden, the government now has a digital option for you. Instead of queuing up in the counter or calling up the telephone to get something done, you now can go online and get something done, which is probably a preferred mode for many people because it's a lot more effective. Now, you have seen the change from being more efficient to become more effective. The whole concept of digitalization only came in much later, probably like in the late 2000s, to about 2010 or so. And there was a big bridge. The initial part was what we call digitization, whereby we take things that are physical and we make it in a digital medium. Converting a physical form into a PDF form is digitization. Does it make a lot of difference? Not really, but it does help. But all of a sudden, with new technology, just like the government, every other part of the industry, banking, the tech industry, finance, etc., all realize that we can use technology to solve compelling problems in a better way. And that's where digitalization comes into play. The ability to use technology to effectively solve problems, not in the old-fashioned way, but in a way. So I'll give you an example. Look at groundbreaking companies like Uber, for example. Uber used technology in a very different way. Instead of just being a taxi company, they were able to use technology to really bring together the entire ecosystem of public transportation, right? Look at Netflix, for example. It totally destroyed the video and audio industry, for example. They were able to use technology in a very effective way to deliver mediums of music or video contents, etc., through the internet. And today you enjoy Netflix at home without ever having to go to Blockbuster to rent the video, for example. These are, for lack of a better word, paradigm changes. They are not small changes, they are very dramatic changes. And that's why digitalization is important. And government needs to go through the same way. And in this series of conversation, we will talk a lot about how the government is slowly transforming itself to truly becoming digital and to be able to look at citizens more as customers rather than just a bunch of people that we serve, basically. The moment you think of citizens as customers, you really think quite differently. And digitalization will play a very important part in that.
Now, when I came to Singapore in the year 2000, I was very familiar with what we called the Infocom Development Authority. And then we also had in parallel the Media Development Authority for like the film and music and media industry. And then eventually the two of those merged into the Infocom and Media Development Authority. But GovTech is not that. GovTech has origins related to that. But you might explain how GovTech came to be and why it came to be in the context of the types of things you just explained.
Yeah, when I first joined IDA, which is what you mentioned, Infocom Development Authority, in 2014, IDA had three big portions. One was about the regulatory of Infocom. So it was really a regulatory agency. Two, they were focused on industry development. How do we better develop the infotech industry in Singapore? And the third part was this whole big group of people called GCIO, Government Chief Information Office. I came in as a Government Chief Information Officer. That's how I joined IDA, basically. If you look carefully at these things, the functions are quite different. First part was regulatory, pure regulatory. It's about, and mostly was about telcos, regulating telcos, postal service, etc. The second part was really very outward facing. How do we make the industry a lot more able to bring in the real technology, etc., for the rest of Singapore? The third part, which is the GCO function, was really about technology in the government. So in late 2016, there was a realization that there was a sister agency called MDA, functioning quite similarly, looking at media for regulatory as well as industry development.
Right. But by those days, the boundaries between Infocom and media...
They become, you can't tell the difference, right? Because media and Infocom became one and the same. So it made a lot of sense for IMDA to be formed, to regulate both the telco as well as the media, as well as to do industry development for that. But then there was one big group of people that was really focused on the technology within the government. And during that point in time, the so-called the momentum was really starting about how do we digitalize the government. So it makes a lot of sense for the GCL function to eventually become GovTech, to focus on very much digitalizing the government in Singapore. So that was the logic behind it.
So just to summarize, that the parts of what were the former Infocom Development Authority and the Media Development Authority came together, and the people who did the policy work related to regulation, the policy work related to industry development, industry promotion, we would call it. Okay. Both the professionals within the user firms as well as the firms that specialize in that industry, they stayed together in IMDA.
Right.
And the people who operated IT systems, procured IT systems, planned IT systems, they split off into this new entity called GovTech.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. And when that happened, was GovTech in the computerization business as they had been for the prior decades, or were they in the digital government business, or was that right at the transition boundary?
Actually, the whole digitalization journey started before this split or merger, whichever you want to call it, right? When I first came in, most of the GCL function was to support many of the agencies, about 60 agencies, in running IT, basically. And during that time, a significant portion, like probably 95% of everything was outsourced. There wasn't so-called innate digital capabilities within GCL at all. One of the key things I think we did at the very beginning was that we realized that building capabilities was very important. We wanted to be able to build the same kind of digital capability like a Google have done, basically, that could lead to massive and fundamental transformation in the government. So that started probably in 2014 with a very small group. I'm not ashamed to tell you this, that we probably started with 7 or 8 people, not like army of people. But a small group of people very quickly showed the value of digital technology, right? They were able to do things quickly, high quality. They were able to be very agile, and we talk a lot about agility later on. And more importantly is that they were able to adapt very quickly to the needs of the government.
So let me ask a question, because there is another type of wisdom. I won't say it's the conventional wisdom, but well, gee, if you have your own group, even if you start small and grow, you're always limited to your own group. If you just procure from the market, wouldn't you have a bigger supply? Couldn't you move faster? So help us understand the rationale for wanting to build the internal capability vis-a-vis what you can procure.
I think there was 2 compelling thoughts that was going through at that time. The first is that you can only procure wisely if you truly understand technology. Very important. The bad thing about being so-called outsourced most of the time is that over time you became a contract manager. You're not really even a technology manager. But if you start building very core internal capabilities, you become more capable of challenging the industry, right? You know what you're going to buy, whether it makes sense or not, whether is it cost effective, whether it's a right way of architecting a system. These kind of skills are important, because if you do not know what you're buying, you normally get yourself into a lot of trouble. So that was the first kind of a stroke of thinking that was important. The second thing is that I think as a government in Singapore, we also wanted to challenge the industry to upgrade itself. During that time, many of the system integrators were doing literally very cut and dry technology work, enterprise technology, building monolithic system from scratch, not really leveraging on really the state-of-the-art technology like cloud, leveraging the ecosystem, using SaaS softwares, etc. So if the government is able to point that direction, it uplifts the entire industry, not just the government.
Moves them,
moves
almost
them.
forces them.
In some ways, you have no choice. Right?
Yes.
And because of that, until today, we still procure at least 70% of our technology. But that 30% that is kind of like grown within the government has become the catalyst to make this happen.
Well, that's an important observation. There's another aspect, Cheow Hoe, for people familiar with doing IT projects. Procurement works well when you know exactly what you want to procure. But as you were doing this work in 2014, 15, 16, and so many changes were happening in the environment, was it possible to procure when you're not even sure exactly how and what?
Yeah, so Steve, I think one of the very important things we realize is that how do people figure out what they want to buy in the first place, right? And this kind of realization struck me probably in the first year of my work here, when I was doing a speech to a bunch of people, and a young guy put up his hand and asked me a very, I would say, innocent question. So what's the difference between the business requirement document and the user journey document? And I was like, okay, I was stunned actually. I was sitting there and I'm like, that was a very interesting, thought-provoking question. And then you realize one thing. For the longest time, government, like all other big companies, write all this wonderful business requirement document, or user requirement document, they call it. And then you ask yourself the question, who is the user? And then you realize the user is that person sitting there operating the system for the last 25 years. He's not the customer. He's the guy operating the system. A user journey document is someone who's a customer. You understand the pain points of the customer. You are able to really understand where, what the person really needs. And the definition of a customer is actually very important in that journey itself. So when this whole journey happened, we started making the transformation away from just writing user requirement documents to understand the user journey and understand the concept of a customer and focus on what we call an outside-in approach versus an inside-out approach towards the government digitalization journey. And I think that's when true digitalization happens. And to summarize, it's all about solving a problem for the customer.
Right.
And I think that's really the most important thing.
But when you get into that mindset, as we've learned from the lessons of what so many industries have done, you can't always just ask that end customer what they want, because what they say and what they really want aren't always the same. You need to trial. You need to experiment.
Yep.
You need to do. You need to see what happens when you put things in people's hands. How did this need and thinking relate to your own strategy for building up internal capability?
Right. So you're right, Steve. The first thing is that you still need a level of understanding of what the basic things that the customer wants. And that's where the so-called, the initial problem definition is. It's really about defining a problem. Once you define a problem, you start trying to understand what is the best way to solve the problem. And that's why technology doesn't even come in the first place. It's really about understanding a problem they're trying to solve and what kind of technology could be useful in solving this problem. Once that starts, that's where the agile process and the iterative process comes into play. You start building what we call minimal viable products. Why minimal viable products? Because we want to build something small and quick and able to test as often as we can.
Get feedback.
Get feedback.
Right.
So when you do an MVP, which is what we call it, your ability to then show a real product to a person who's using the product and observe what the person does with it. You're right that most of the time, the customer may not tell you exactly what he wants, but through his or her interaction with that minimal viable product, you're able to observe many of these things. It's the person struggling with the UI. It's the person struggling with how to navigate through certain things. It's the person really trying to, is that viable product even solving its problems in the first place?
Yeah, so what you're saying is IDA, and then later as it became IMDA, the government CIO office had the capability to manage, oversee the conventional types of IT procurement and the follow-on processes. But this bit that you just explained about agile efforts to create minimal viable prototypes, as you said, you couldn't do that without in-house capability.
No, you can't.
And then that became a policy decision to build that capability. So you started with 7. What's the approximate size of that capability now?
You see, if you look at really the engineering team within GovTech itself today, we have close to 1,000 people. So we have grown from like 7 people to about 1,000 people. And they cover literally a spectrum of things, right? All the way from what we call digital services, which is application, to data science and AI, to infrastructure like cloud, for example,
Right.
to cybersecurity, which is quite important in protecting all these things, and then finally to sensors and IoT, which has become the cyber-physical world. Cyber-physical digital world is colliding.
Right.
And I think that's where it all comes together also.
So to create this capability to do minimal viable products, well, maybe not ironically, it's as if you did it in a agile, minimal viable product way, because you only started with a very small team.
Yep.
And potentially any country could do that.
Of course.
So there's no such thing as being too small to start in that direction.
No, of course not. You know, we have, if you look around this office here, you'll see quite a lot of these posters, right? And we believe in one philosophy, which is think big, start small, act fast. It's quite important, right? You got to think big. The minimal viable product is not the end product. It's the start of the product, right? So you need to think of a much larger space of what this should become, have the ambition. But you got to start really fast, right? Because there's no point saying that I'll do it in 3 years. 3 years is too long. So if you start fast and you start small, you're able to iterate. And maybe in 3 years' time, you get there somehow, but you have probably been like 10 iterations already. And your product keeps getting better and better and better.
All right.
And I think that's really the key.
So I want to come back to the national level policy aspects of how we create our ability to do digital government in Singapore. And we created this new group called GovTech, which in addition to some of the still never goes away, keep the lights on type of efforts and standard procurement efforts, you built up this entirely new in-house capability. Tell us a little bit about where GovTech is situated in the government's organization. We often hear in Singapore about this Smart Nation and Digital Government Office. What's the relationship between them and GovTech and between these entities and the rest of the government?
You know, when IDA was around, IDA used to report to the Ministry of Communication and Information, which is a very logical kind of like linkage, because a big part was communication and information. But when GovTech was formed, it was deliberate that GovTech was moved to the Prime Minister's office.
To the Prime Minister's office. What's the significance of that? What does that mean practically?
One of the interesting things is that GovTech became part of what we call center of government, whereby it's not affiliated to one ministry, but it's really in the center of government that could affect change throughout the government. I think that's a very important part. When GovTech was created, a group was also created within the Prime Minister's office called Smart Nation Digital Government Office. Now, this is actually a very important group. GovTech is really much more what we call an implementation agency, but in terms of policy, strategy, etc., is very much managed by the Smart Nation Digital Government Office, of which the Government Chief Digital Technology Office belongs to.
All right, so let me help so people can understand this. we still have IMDA, our Infocom
Right.
Media Development Authority, and they have all kinds of policy people dealing with the media industry and the infocom industry, right? The technology has been split out to GovTech, the technology implementation. So you made reference to policy people
Okay.
in the Smart Nation and Digital Government Office. So it's not the same policy
No, it's
that
not.
we're doing under IMDA.
No, it's not.
So help us understand the policy that the Smart Nation and Digital Government people are doing within the Prime Minister's office.
You must understand that there are policy that kind of configures the external part of industry facing like IMDA does, but there's also policy for the internal government. So I'll give one example. When I first joined in 2014, we were fighting tooth and nail to try to use commercial cloud, and it was forbidden, right? The internal policy does not allow the use of commercial cloud. Credit a lot to Smart Nation Digital Government Office. I think we worked together very closely. We were able to rethink and redress many of the concerns of commercial cloud, and then came out with a commercial cloud policy for the whole of government. Now, these policies are very important because it unlocks a significant part of technology that really help the digitalization effort. And this is just one of so many examples, whether it's a national digital identity policy, for example, whether it's a cloud policy, whether it's the Smart Nation Census Platform policies. These things have to be crafted in a way that allows GovTech to be able to function well and implement them.
So the key message here is within the government, within what's called the core of government that can work horizontally, there's a policy group for how we use advanced IT, digitization, data across all of government.
Correct. And you got to understand one thing, Steve, is that what we are doing is quite transformational. The government, as it is not used to it. So the ability to come up with new policies, the policies are written was very much for the old enterprise IT kind of approach. Now you're literally changing the paradigm.
Well, and this other point that, I mean, Singapore is a small country, but still the government and the country is a complex entity.
Right.
And even at our smaller size, there's a natural tendency to work things by ministry because
Yeah, of course.
it's not a bad thing. It's just easier to understand. It's easier for people to get a grip on. So this bit about doing digital government policy across the government, you said it's a new thing. It's a transformative thing. Just elaborate a little bit on that.
You must understand that many of the internal policy of government, for technology example, were written very much for, as I mentioned, the word enterprise IT. So for example, I use a cloud example again. The concept of cloud was never in the minds of any of this policy written. For the longest time, technology infrastructure means having a data center somewhere with servers and firewalls that you can touch. Now, all of a sudden, these things disappear, right? And it goes to some amorphous cloud somewhere in the ether sphere, for example. The policy doesn't cater for that.
Never anticipated.
Never anticipated that in the first place. So all of a sudden, somebody has to rewrite the policy to cater for something that's quite different, but at the same time, able to address a lot of concerns of the government, for example, security, right? What kind of workloads can go to the cloud? Where does the data reside? Must it be in Singapore? Must it be outside Singapore? Can it be outside anywhere else? Do we have physical control over some of this infrastructure? Now, these things are very difficult policy considerations.
And obviously, if every ministry worked those independently,
It will never happen.
It would be a problem.
It will never happen, yeah.
Right.
So SNDG plays a very important role together with GovTech to make this a government-wide implementation rather than just policy, what you call agency by agency approach, basically.
This idea to have under the Prime Minister's office, so right at the core to work horizontally, the ability to have this pairing of Smart Nation Digital Government Office to work the policy side, GovTech to work the implementation. Where did the idea come from? Did people in Singapore see an example of this externally from another country, or it was just the only workable solution that just came up bottom up internally?
I think this is a lot of credit to our leaders, right? And frankly speaking, I think many of these ideas came from Prime Minister himself, right? And to govern SNDG and GovTech, we have this thing called an interministerial committee consisting of 5 ministers. So, all of a sudden it's not one minister anymore. You got 5 ministers, right?
Which is a good sampling. We have more than 5 ministries,
Right.
but 5 ministers who can collectively represent the
entire
entire
government.
interest and mindset.
Exactly. And it's chaired by our senior minister, Hsien, which is a very senior a person chairing the committee.
And he actually has a horizontal portfolio versus
Right.
in his earlier years, he had more a vertical ministry.
And this is really an evolutionary process. The first couple of years was difficult. We tried to implement small projects. It was okay. The moment it touches whole government projects, it was very difficult. The new structure allows us to address many of these problems.
So what you're saying is that the national policy of having Smart Nation Digital Government Office, the policy group, together with GovTech, the technology capability group, doing both external sourcing and internal development, putting them in this central core, to some extent became the enablement for everything.
Exactly.
That was the national policy that set everything on its path.
That's correct.
Yes. And that's relatively recent in the sense of the Smart Nation initiative being announced by Prime Minister in 2014. Just walk us through again and help us refresh the chronology of when GovTech was created, when the Smart Nation Digital Government Office was created, and it was all placed under the Prime Minister's office.
Yeah, as I said, I think Prime Minister announced a Smart Nation plan in 2014. We started doing a lot of work from 2014 to 2016. And by late 2016, we started having conversations about forming GovTech as well as SNDG under the PMO. So by 2017, that was formed.
PMO being the Prime Minister's office.
Yes, exactly.
Yes.
Yes. And we are today because of that.
Right. So it's worth reflecting that Singapore's deliberate, focused, programmatic efforts in applying computing technology to government. Let's take the year 1980 as a starting point for some of the major programs. And then towards the second half of the 4th decade, so there's a trajectory there, the administrative policies are changed to put in place GovTech and the Smart Nation Digital Government Office. And here we are at the very beginning of the 5th decade. 2020 would be the beginning of our 5th decade, where we're moving forward. Do you envision any other national level policy changes to create the enabling ability for doing digital government?
I think one of the things that we will probably touch on a lot more later is that now that the structure is in place, it's important then to empower each of the ministry family to be able to lead the digital revolution, lack of a better word. And that's the reason why we started this thing called a Ministry Family Digitalization Plan.
So this is really important because we just spent the last few minutes talking about the tremendous advantage of having this central group who can work horizontally, but the reality of vertical pillars of ministries and their very substantial needs does not go away.
Of course.
You could call them lines of business. Of course, we're talking public sector here and government. So talk to us about the relationship, how at a national level we sort of curate and manage and shepherd the relationship between the ministries and their interest and what you call the core of government, the whole of government.
I think the creation of SNDG and GovTech allows us to take what we call functional leadership for technology and digitalization. I think that was a very important point, another inflection point that we went through. Once that's done, I think the next part was quite important. I think there are three things that are quite important after that. First is, what do we mean by digitalization in the first place, right? And I think one of the first things that came up is that, we always use the word, you cannot manage what you can measure. So what do you mean by digitalization? Let's put some bets on the table, in the sense of a word, right? And that's why we came up with this thing called the Government Digitalization Plan, right? And it's important because, and we publish it actually. Publicly, which is quite important, right? And the reason why we did it is because we wanted to put some markers on the floor and say for Singapore to evolve to a certain point, this digital government blueprint allows us to achieve certain things, certain markers to get there. And I think that's very, very important.
All right. So in terms of getting everything to mesh together, you mentioned the existence of a digital government blueprint that would come out of GovTech and Smart Nation Digital Government Office. But you also mentioned working with ministry families because of the realities that these ministries are large, are complex, have focused needs. So continue telling us the story about how these things come together.
So then that's part one, right? Getting the digital government blueprint together to really put the markers on the floor, basically. The second part that was quite important is that to start developing a level of leadership in each of the ministry families to lead digitalization. So we started this thing called the Ministry Family Digitalization Plan, which kind of like pull every single ministry together. Ministry family includes the agencies under them together.
Right.
Now, to do that, we also appointed what we call a bunch of very senior leaders, deputy secretary level people, to become the digitalization officer for each of the ministries.
Yes. Let me clarify a point because there's a complex terrain here. When we say we help to appoint people within each ministry to pull the ministries together, each ministry is large, complicated, has several entities.
Right.
Each ministry has multiple agencies and organizations under it. And then, of course, there are the different ministries themselves. So when you say pulled together in this instance, it's pulled together within a ministry.
Yes.
Because a ministry is more than the ministry. It's all of its agencies and special units that report up to the parent ministry.
So we appoint for each agency a chief digital strategy officer.
Right.
And this is a very senior person.
Each agency
each
or
ministry
each
family.
ministry?
Each ministry.
Because the agencies are under the ministries.
Correct.
Right.
And these are very senior people.
Yes.
Most of them are deputy secretaries and above, right? And the reason why is because you need ownership. You need the senior people in the ministry families to own the digitalization journey for their ministry families. So GovTech starts to do a lot of the horizontal. These people start doing a lot of the verticals, which is quite important.
And then just say something about how the horizontal and the vertical coordinate, plan, work out differences, mesh, synergize, because that's the essence of operating government. That's where the action is at that interface.
Right. So when I said GovTech was more focused on the horizontal, we were building platforms that could be used by everybody, right? So many of what we call, and we'll talk a little bit about that probably next.
We'll get into our subsequent
on what we call strategic national projects.
Yes.
And these are many of the core platforms that everybody needs to use. So, for example, I spoke about cloud quite a fair bit, right? The government and commercial cloud, GCC, is a horizontal platform. We also built a full stack called the government tech stack, for example, horizontal platform. National digital identity, horizontal platform that everybody uses. But each of the ministry have their own use cases, have their own problems to solve, but they sit on top and use this platform as much as possible without reinventing the wheel.
Cheow Hoe, you just gave some examples of a few horizontal platforms, and you made the comment that, quote unquote, everyone uses them. And by everyone, we mean the different ministries, and they use them in ways to serve their actual end users. So why do the ministries use GovTech's horizontal platforms? Because they just like the design, or it's required policy? How does that happen?
You know, like everything else you do in life, there's always a carrot and a stick. And I want to be honest about it, right? But one thing that I think GovTech does, which is quite important, is that we take a very commercial approach towards building products. The most important thing is that people need to feel that the product is relevant to them. And that's where the carrot part comes into play, right? If the product's no good and we force people to use it, it'll just be a disaster. Now, that being said, there are certain things that we thought from a policy point of view, again, is important to enforce. For example, national digital identity. You can't have a government with 20 different digital identities. You have one. And that's why SingPass, which is part of national digital identity, is used by all agencies as part of a policy.
All right, so that's mandated.
That's mandated.
Right.
But not everything is mandated. In fact, the rest are not. Why do we have government and commercial cloud? Of course, agencies can go out there and use their own Amazon or Azure or GCP. But what we did was that we were able to package compliance, security, data residency, etc., into a package that by just using government or commercial cloud, you don't have to worry about these things.
Well, and these are all very intricate things.
Correct.
And most ministries, even if they put the time into it, wouldn't have the expertise to know how to work it out.
Exactly. The third thing which you see that's quite important is that more and more so, and we'll talk a lot about that in the next segment, we are more interested in building platforms than just single applications. Now, let me explain that a little bit. Government agencies might be very different from a domain point of view. Some agency might be doing finance, another agency could be doing animals, veterinary application, health, security. They're all different from a domain point of view. But functionally, the role of government is not different. That's the thing I think we need to think through quite a fair bit. So, for example, one of the role of government is to regulate through licenses. Does the government need 60 licensing system, or does it need one for different domains? And that's why we've been moving towards a platform. So we have built a platform, for example, for business grants, a platform for licensing, for example, so the individual agencies can just onboard their license onto something that's common throughout the whole government.
Right. So what you just said was that, of course, licensing requirements within each of the specific ministries is going to be very domain specific,
Exactly.
very particular, very different knowledge, rules, et cetera, circumstances, but that the properties of doing a licensing product are actually quite similar and quite generic.
Exactly.
And if you have good design principles, a horizontal platform could be used to instantiate for each ministry.
So I'll give you an example, right? You know, in licensing, what do? You collect data from the applicant. You process the data in some ways through a set of business rules. Then you decide whether to grant the license or not. You issue a notification. You then collect payments if you need to collect. You maintain records, for example. You send reminders. So these are all functional things that are no different from a licensing process point of view.
Yes.
But the business rules are going to be different.
That's right.
Whether you grant a dog license or finance license is going to be very, very different, right? But from a functional point of view, they are not that different. But from a domain point of view, they are. And a well-designed platform can take that into account. Once you design a platform well, you're able to then keep onboarding as many licenses as you possibly can without necessarily reinventing the wheel. Quality will be better, governance is better, security is better, and the speed to market will be improved dramatically. because you're not rebuilding the world.
Yes. And those are the cases when you can do things through common platforms.
Right.
But of course, not all of the ministry's needs can be met through common
course.
platforms.
Of course.
Yes. And then what would the ministries do when they have these unique needs that cannot be sourced through GovTech common platforms? How would they then go about fulfilling what they need?
So again, if there's something that's quite unique, for example, they can still use the central services, maybe not the platforms, but they will still use things like common services like SingPass, for example, NDI, for example. They'll use the commercial cloud. So the horizontal systems that we put in place are relevant to them whether they build a single monolithic system for themselves because of their very unique needs, or they use a platform.
So if I understand you right, the services that GovTech is building, in some cases, the ministries use them as products.
Right.
And then put in their particulars, of course.
Right.
But in some cases, they use them as smaller building blocks.
Exactly.
Because you might have worked out security issues or certain kinds of within government data exchange issues.
Exactly.
And then they'll use that as a module within some larger system that they procure with a vendor.
Absolutely. And this is the right way forward, not just for ourselves, but if you look at the tech giants, it's all different.
You are the government chief digital technology officer, right?
Right.
And you have frequent interfaces with these people who are called the chief digital strategy officer, who work in each of the what we call ministry families. What are the nature of those discussions? Are those informal types of guidance and exchange? Is it formal decision and policy making? Because that's the alignment of the horizontal with the vertical.
Yep. Actually, there are many levels of interaction. We do bring them together on a regular basis as part of SNDG, whereby we share a lot of the use cases and success and failures also. And I think we learn together in that entire journey. I think the key thing to bring together people is to learn together, right? There is no one single way or 100 different ways. It's really about how do we learn from each other? What are the success stories? What are the failures? And I think that's a very important first step.
Right. And it must be bi-directional. I would suspect they pull on you and say, we need this.
They also contribute.
Give examples of both pulling and contributing.
So for example, as I said, the central platforms, we kind of like try to pull them in.
Right.
But we also look at different agencies and ministries. And for those who have done a good job in certain areas, we pull them up, right? Because it's not just about GovTech building everything. The agencies and the ministries contribute a lot in building the common platform. Some of the stuff that was built by, let's say, CPF or IRAS, etc., we do onboard into the common platforms.
Right. So that's our Central Provident Fund to manage the National Retirement System. IRAS is our Inland Revenue Authority,
yes.
which is our taxation.
Yep.
So you said they have this, platform systems that have been around for many years.
And some of them do a good job, very good job, right? And I think the important thing is that they all should and can contribute to the central platform. Not everybody have to rebuild everything from scratch.
So you get some ideas from them based on their long operating experience.
Not just ideas, real products that they have built that could be institutionalized, for the lack of a better word.
I get it.
Yeah.
So, but through GovTech, you're able to spot well-functioning modules that not only serve a particular industry, but once you understand the design rationale behind it, can be abstracted,
of course,
to work as an an engine for multiple of our ministries, and you, in a way, borrow that, make use of it.
Of course, and the idea is that no one agency or GovTech or SNDG have a monopoly of wisdom. Wisdom comes from the entire government.
Right, both horizontally and vertically.
Exactly. And I think that's the beauty of a structure like this.
You made reference to a digital government blueprint. Now, literally, when we think of the word blueprint, of course, it comes from the architectural and building industry, and it was a certain kind of document of how you actually physically build the building. When you say a digital government blueprint, what is that? Is it a document in words? Is it technical drawings? Is it policies?
The digital government blueprint came about because, as I said, we really wanted to put some stakes on the ground in terms of what we as an entire government need to achieve to really move forward as a digital government. And I know the word blueprint is used in a very broad format. It's not really an architectural diagram. It's basically a series of outcomes that needs to be made for us to declare to ourselves that actually we have made some improvements.
Only outcomes or principles and outcomes?
More outcomes, but some principles in there too. And it's very important for the government. Why? Because in a private sector, the main outcome is, do you make money? It's very simple, right? If you don't make money, it probably is not going to be very useful. If it makes a lot of money, we should invest in that. But in the government, I think to be able to define what constitutes success is actually quite important.
Yes.
And the digital government blueprints allows us to do that and to bring everybody together on the same journey rather than people running around doing different things altogether.
So it's helping to get alignment on where we're trying to go, what we're trying to do, without getting into the design of a particular system, because that all happens under the sort of the policy auspices of the blueprint.
Right.
Okay, we'll come back to the blueprint in more detail a little bit later on. As we move on this journey, for example, from 2014 on, when the Prime Minister announced the Smart Nation, from 2017 on, when we have the formation of Smart Nation Digital Government Office and GovTech, how do we know where we are? How do we have a sense of digital maturity? Do you have some concept of tracking where you are relative to where you want to be, not on a micro particular project, but a degree of digital government maturity overall?
Yeah. Actually, we do work with BCG, the Boston Consulting Group, to come up with a methodology that we apply to all agencies in the government. And the idea of a digital maturity index allows the leadership in each of the agencies to self-assess. Now, it's actually very difficult to accurately measure maturity. It's actually very difficult. I think as an academic, you know that.
Well, but do you need precision here?
No, you don't.
Or do you need broad directional sense?
So we tend to, in Singapore, we tend to be quite hard on ourselves. We like to make sure that we are doing the right things. And so we started the Digital Maturity Index work about 2 years ago, whereby we get each and every agency to nominate the key leadership positions to do their own assessment. And it may be a perception assessment, but it's important, right? Because perception is like probably 9/10 of reality in that sense. And then we can over the years track whether we're actually moving upwards.
So this is really interesting. They have this framework. Each ministry can do its self-assessment. I assume GovTech as well would do its own self-assessment.
Yes.
And do these self-assessments get reported to other units in the government, or do you get to keep them private and work on the results of your self-assessment?
Actually, these documents are shared then with senior leadership, including the PERMSECs and ministers. So this actually goes all the way up to the ministers, actually.
All right.
So that they do see where their agency or ministry is, situated in a sense.
So it's both a sharing and an evaluation.
Exactly. And it's important because it allows people to have a sense of how much more they need to do to get to where they want to be. Because there's always an aspiration part also. Where do you want to go? Where are you today? And what does it take to get you there, basically?
Wow. So it seems the big policy levers that have really enabled Singapore's digital government journey was the formation of GovTech. Within GovTech, building the ability to do more than just manage external vendors, the ability to build products and platforms, right? The government-wide Smart Nation Digital Government Office that does the coordinating policy for all of government. The explicit and very purposeful efforts to align with each of the ministries, and not just the ministry, but its family in the sense of all of its related agencies and units. And then we clarified that within each of these ministries, they have their own chief digital strategy officer that you coordinate with, or your office coordinates with. And that everyone horizontally and vertically is doing a digital maturity self-assessment. And while it's a self-assessment, the results get shared.
Yep.
Right? So this seems to what's driving the pump, if you will.
That's correct.